Good evening. Welcome to the Milwaukee Film YouTube channel for this exclusive conversation about the film Mossville, When Great Trees Fall. We have with us Alex Glostrom, the director, the producer Daniel Bennett, and Monique Harden, a consultant in the film and one of the subjects of the film as well. So Mossville is available right now through the virtual cinema series by Milwaukee Film called Sofa Cinema. And it's part of the Minority Health Film Series. It's presented by Milwaukee Film and Freighted and the Medical College of Wisconsin. It began back a week ago, this past Friday. And the namesake of the film is a small town in Louisiana. And it was a once thriving community founded by formerly enslaved and free people of color, as well as an economically flourishing safe haven for generations of African American families. It has now become a breeding ground for petrochemical plants and their toxic black clouds. The fact that April is National Minority Health Month marks a tragic coincidence with the current stay-at-home order in Wisconsin and many states throughout the country due to the current global pandemic. And this especially rings true when one observes the high percentage of people of color who have contracted or died from COVID-19 just in Milwaukee County. The Minority Health Film Series furthers the efforts of the country's first annual Minority Health Film Festival, which launched in September of last year. It was the first festival of its kind to feature both films and conversations about health issues that directly affected communities of specific racial, ethnic, and cultural identities. As we look at the film Mossville in the time of COVID-19, major observation is that while anyone can be infected by the virus, there are nonetheless major disparities along racial lines that this current crisis has revealed in terms of proximity of specific communities to hospitals. The crisis also reveals the absence of initiatives to address environmental and economic deficiencies in neighborhoods where Black residents are densely populated. The Minority Health Film Festival emerged from similar initiatives that brought to fruition Black Lens and Cine Sin Fronteras, two of Milwaukee Film's cultural pillars. And we're going to shift to our conversation. And since I mentioned Black Lens, a few things I want to mention. First of all, I'll just let you know who I am. I'm Dante McFadden. I am the Community Programming and Education Coordinator of Black Lens for Milwaukee Film. And then I mentioned that this is sponsored by Milwaukee Film and Freighted in Medical College of Wisconsin. And the Minority Health Film Series, rooting from the Minority Health Film Festival, all of this is the brainchild of Gerard Blanks, who's the Director of Cultures and Communities that houses Black Lens, Cine Sin Fronteras, Genre Queer and Community Festivals, and Heidi Moore, who works out of Freighted in the Medical College of Wisconsin. So they are pretty much the people who are the reason why not only Mossville is available for you all to see until this Thursday, but the reason we're having this conversation right now. And I want to go ahead and allow our esteemed guest who made this fine, urgent, engaging film to just go ahead and introduce themselves. So who'd like to begin?
I can go ahead and begin. I'm Alex Glustrom. I'm the director of the film. I grew up in Atlanta, Georgia, but I've been living in New Orleans for the last 15 or so years. I'm a filmmaker, a visual artist, and I spend most of my work life doing documentary work, freelance journalism, and commercial directing.
Thank you.
My name is Daniel Bennett. I'm one of the producers of Mossville, and I'm actually a community member. I was born and raised in Mossville, and I live about 10 minutes away from Mossville now in a town called Moss Bluff, ironically. I am a photographer and a full-time banker, actually. So a lot of my work comes from those. So I am on the team as kind of, well, obviously as a producer, but also an analysis person for, making sure that the film stays true to life. So that's who I am.
Thanks.
And good evening. My name is Monique Harden. I'm a resident of New Orleans, Louisiana. I'm a lawyer and I work at the Deep South Center for Environmental Justice. And for a good part of my adult life, I served Mossville residents, organized as Mossville Environmental Action Now as their community environmental justice lawyer.
Thanks. Thank you all for being here. So first and foremost, I just want to say once again, thank you for making this film. And it's very urgent to the time that we're living in right now. But even with the subject matter that the film covers, just talking about environmental racism and the way in which residents are purged from a town simply because a major corporation wants to establish its own footing to produce something that does destroy communities and destroys people's lives. It made me think of a film by Marco Williams called Banished. And it was about towns that had purged Black populations and became entirely white. Obviously, this is a different kind of film, and this is a different kind of dispersing of people, whether it be to buying them out or whether it be through the chemicals that infects them and ultimately kills them. But that's something that ran through my mind. And in addition to that, just to make, just to talk about Milwaukee very briefly, we think about how people of color, particularly African Americans, Latinx communities, live in housing, that has not only lead paint, but also lead poisoning in the water. That's been a issue that Milwaukee has been dealing with for the last few years. And so, that's something that, comes to mind when we talk about, the environment disproportionately affecting communities of color. But I like to transition into just talking about how this film got started. So Alex, Monique, I understand that you both met at the screening of Alex's previous documentary, Big Charity, about the country's oldest hospital in New Orleans, where people were trapped inside during Hurricane Katrina. And I'd like for the both of you to talk about this initial exchange and how it led to the making of this film.
You want to start, Alex?
Yeah, sure. So I think I had met Monique before that. I definitely knew who you were. Monique may be modest, but she is definitely a very well-known heroic figure in the environmental justice and social justice community in New Orleans. And so I was honored to share the stage with you during the panel discussion for Big Charity. And afterwards, yeah, we were talking and you told me about Mossville, and he said, I want to take you out there. And if I remember right, I thought that would mean that we would drive out there together that next Friday. And then I think that Friday, something came up for you and you said, here's the address. So you just go on out there. And I drove out there, and waiting for me at the Mossville Rec were Daniel's parents, as well as a number of members of Mossville Environmental Action Now.
Well, and the reason why I wanted Alex to think about making a film chronicling the lives of residents in Mossville was because the work that I just saw in the Big Charity film really had those same themes in terms of dealing with crisis situations where health is on the line and life is on the line, and the ways in which, as big and as heavy as that is, it's really diminished and made really small because there are other agendas and other priorities. And that and how race makes that, facilitates that, right? And so it was, I thought the situation in Mossville was something that was growing increasingly without clear remedies, I'll put it that way. And the need for being able to tell the story and to speak truth to power was something that needed a real artful and sensitive filmmaker. And I'm so glad Alex jumped on and saw and developed relationships that continue to this day with residents in Mossville. And one of the other things I think was also extremely important was connecting some of the work to the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond with their Undoing Racism workshop, and having some of the Alex and his colleagues go through that training was also really important in terms of how to tell the story and how to be transformed by what goes on in Mossville. Like I can never be the same person again after going to Mossville and spending as much time as I have. But the first moment you're in Mossville, for me, was a feeling like the utter injustice was just so palpable and so strong, it made me cry. To see modest homes of African Americans who you could tell cared and loved their neighborhood and their community. You could see it in how the landscaping, the paint on the home, like people cared about their community, but that care did not was not reflected back. That there was a concerted effort to push as much large, heavy, toxic industrial facilities on this historic African American community, now numbering 15. So that level of injustice and racism fueling it, this environmental racism, is a story that has, I think, deep human rights dimensions in terms of how we all live, how we can all live in our parallel universes with the Mossville, and knowing that there's more Mossvilles, that it's systemic and it's global, as was shown as an example shown in the film with the South African counterpart to the Mossville story.
Indeed. And I like to talk about more of that correlation later in the conversation. Daniel, you are from Mossville, that's your hometown. And I'd like for you to talk about your personal history about being from Mossville, as well as how you met Monique and Alex. And what were some of the things you informed them about the town that you thought were critical to the development of this documentary?
I can't recall when I first met Miss Monique. She's known me for as long as I can remember. So yeah, I was pretty young. I think, if I'm not mistaken, we took a trip to DC together, and I must have been maybe just turning a teenager. I may have been 13. And we were going to do something. Honestly, I was not involved at all. I don't really know, but I just knew that growing up in Mossville, my cousins and we all kind of had, respiratory issues. I didn't think of it as an issue. I didn't realize just how what kind of situation we were in at the time. The water was brown coming out of the faucet at times, and I could remember growing up, and there was always somebody trying to test water and somebody testing air, and there was always a film crew, or there was always just somebody saying something about the environment. But as a preteen, obviously, I was probably preoccupied with other things, just trying to live the life of a preteen, And later on in life, I got into the arts a lot more. And Alex came to town, and I avoided Alex because I thought it was weird to just kind of do what my parents was suggesting. They were telling me to kind of push myself onto Alex and, hey, get to know him, be a part of his team. And I was like, guys, it's weird. So I stayed away from Alex for quite some time. But once I joined the team, I realized that artful and sensitive is probably really good descriptors for Alex, and I think he is the right person for the job. And it was different because they did invite me onto the team. Several other film crews and reporters were all extractive, and they were taking from without actually really involving anyone from the community. And Alex and the Mossville team, we all went about it differently. So that was one of the big things. I think this has been an enlightening experience for me because I didn't realize just how abnormal my life was in Mossville until, going to a lot of festivals and, speaking to so many people. One of the big things for me was that nobody really knew what a shelter in place was. And for those who may not know what a shelter in place is, it's you go inside, close all doors, windows, turn off ventilation, and listen to the news to see what spill or what release has happened and how it can be toxic, or if it's toxic, and see what to do next. And I didn't realize that wasn't commonplace for everywhere. So that was one of the major enlightening things for me. My parents have always been activists for as long as I can remember, and I know that people have always died from Mossville. I've lost several aunts and uncles to different forms of cancer. So yeah, that was my life growing up in Mossville, and kind of how I came to be a part of the team.
Thanks a lot. Alex, you're a native of Atlanta, and you're also a graduate of Tulane University, based in New Orleans. That's where you work now. That's where you live now. And your background is revelatory in terms of the way your artistry is fused with activism. And I'd like to know how your personal history, especially as someone who's lived in two major southern cities, informed the way you approach this project.
Well, I grew up in Atlanta, as you said. My grandparents were Jewish allies in the civil rights movement, and I grew up listening to their stories. The KKK actually burnt a cross in their lawn when my dad was a kid, and so these were stories that I grew up listening to. Although I never really considered myself much of an activist, although I was very artistically minded. I painted all through my childhood and teenage years, and I was consider myself more of a visual artist than anything. And then moving to New Orleans right before Hurricane Katrina hit was a very life-changing experience for me. I got to witness the ways that the powers that be used Hurricane Katrina as an opportunity to restructure the city, to privatize a lot of the public infrastructure, and it was very moving for me. And I began filming, and that's how I started Big Charity, about the closure and the privatization of New Orleans Charity Hospital. So I think that all those experiences definitely made me who I am and led me to Mossville, and they were very informative for me and how I approached this project.
Thanks. And Monique, if you could talk about how you got into environmental law and how this has been the most effective way for you to combat environmental racism and all types of injustices regarding the environment. And how did this work lead you to Mossville and your investment in seeking justice for this community?
So I began practicing law in Louisiana in 1996. And right off the bat, first cases were dealing with issues of environmental racism here in the state of Louisiana, in Louisiana's Cancer Alley. And having success, like winning those battles against companies that were shoe-ins with support from the governor and the lobbying firms we have in the state that are, members are all the companies, like DuPont, Exxon, et cetera, clamoring for this kind of a project and getting it defeated and blocked, and using environmental law to do that. And while that was happening, also being introduced to residents of Mossville who were dealing with existing facilities that were the same toxic manufacturing of polyvinyl chloride, a lot of dioxin output, tons of pollution, cancer-causing chemicals used to make this kind of plastic. And meeting Mossville residents, and supporting their organizing around under the name of Mossville Environmental Action Now, and looking for resources and ways in. And it was always very difficult because environmental laws are a little tricky. First, they all fail to live up to their titles. It's, we have law called the Clean Air Act, but when you begin to break it apart and see what it's is at its essence, it's just the status quo of industrial operations. Very technical, very complex, but that's essentially what it is. Same thing for the Clean Water Act and all of our federal environmental laws. And so the situation that Mossville was dealing with was legal under our system of environmental law. And people need to understand that's where the demand is for the need for changing it. And so when you're using environmental law, as I have, it's more of a kind of a martial arts exercise where you're looking for omissions and errors in the permit, and you're marrying that to with arguments about what this pollution would do to the community. And so you're wrapping in environmental justice policies, principles, and values. But to win, you have to show that there was an error or an omission in the permit that was approved. And those permits are based on standards that the industries and their lobbyists have worked out that work to their advantage. There's nothing in there about protecting health. There's nothing in there about how close they are to homes. It's just, will you use this particular piece of equipment and this processing flow and hours of operation that are similar to other companies in your industrial sector. If you can show that you will on paper, you get the permit. And so when there are the public hearings and people complain about health and the number of deaths in the community, it falls on deaf ears. It's of no moment under our governmental system. And so the environmental laws, while they have these friendly titles like Clean Air Act and Clean Water Act, they do just the opposite. They make our air dirty, they make our water dirty, and the places where the polluters locate are, you know, where you have these oppressive, racist conditions already in place.
Thank you. And Daniel, as a producer on this project, you offer a vital perspective because Mossville obviously is your hometown. And you talked about this a little bit already. And if you could just say more about your role in the making of this documentary in terms of contributing to how the story is told, and even more so, making sure that the residents' perspectives were at the forefront.
I think that was one of the most challenging things for me. Honestly, I approached it kind of like Alex. I've always felt like I was a creative, and activism wasn't something that, you know, was my forte. I always said that that was my parents' thing. You know, I've always said that I'm a big guy, so I like air conditioning. I like my amenities, so I know that I play my role, you know, in both positive and negative, you know. So member of the team, I tried to take the creative approach, but nothing was more intimidating than the first screening that we did back home. Alex wasn't able to make that screening because we had a terrible storm. And I was almost kind of relieved because I was like, well, here's an opportunity for me to approach this community as a baby of the community, because there were so many other people that I thought were highly qualified to tell more about, you know, what was happening in Mossville with the environment. And you know, when I approach these people, my biggest concern was I don't want to be the guy who's trying to tell all of Mossville's story and then getting it all wrong. You know, so I did kind of get a seal of approval from the community after they saw the film. They agreed. They did send me back with some messages letting people know that, like, hey, people are still fighting. People are still dying. The fight's not over. It's not just Mossville's fight. We are still fighting. You know, so that was one of the big things. And then from Stacy, of course, our main character, Stacy literally used the words, "I'm passing you the torch," which of course felt like kind of a weight on my back. And he said, hey, you know, I've done my part and I'm still trying to do my part, but I'm getting old. My health is deteriorating. It's your turn to go out and represent Mossville and show the world, you know, hey, we need to make a difference and remind people. And you've heard me say it several times, but people have died and people are dying. That is what Stacy asked me to remind the world. And I've given him my word. So as a part of the team, you know, the ultimate goal was to just make sure that we knew what story we were telling. We had some discussion around even what we should call the film. We had discussion around, can we tell a complete story of Mossville, or are we telling, you know, an individual's story of Mossville? We decided that we had to stick with Stacy's story and the Fisher story because it would just be too cumbersome and almost impossible to tell a full synopsis of what's happened in Mossville. So that's where I stand on the team.
Thank you. And I do have some questions to ask about Stacy, Ryan, and the Jackson family. Before I get to that, Alex, I know recently you presented the film at the Wild and Scenic Festival in Nevada City, California, just a couple months ago. And you facilitated a workshop on non-extractive filmmaking practices. First, I'd like for you to talk about what that is. And second, and you know, Daniel and Monique, I'd like for you to come in at this point. Just talk about your contributions in terms of making sure the project was pursued responsibly, that you had a crew of not only diverse skills, but diverse identities, and then also making sure that the residents, that their stories were being told. It just wasn't one person's stories representing the entire stories. It was a multitude of stories.
Sure. So non-extractive filmmaking obviously is very relative to Mossville story in particular, because you're dealing with a lot of industries that are just that. They're extractive and they exploit the resources of a community and don't really care to include them in the decision-making processes, and all they do is take. And so, if you're making a film about those things, it's obviously incredibly important to not follow those same practices. These are things that I haven't always known. These are things that I've learned through this process. As Monique said, one of her first recommendations for us was that we use the very first dollar that we spent from our grant that we got to make this film. We did an Undoing Anti-Racism workshop, and that was one of the places where I learned a lot. And one of the things that I learned and that Monique has stressed and taught us is the importance of inclusion and collaboration with the people who are most affected by the story. Daniel is an incredible producer, aside from being a community member, and he's been a value to this team even beyond just being a community voice. It's not like we just brought him on just for that reason. He's also an incredible photographer and artist, and has a great eye for story and understanding for story structure. But it was really important to have somebody from the community to be a part of the team. I think, first of all, just because it's what makes the film good. It's what makes the film accurate. Having somebody within our team who's in the edit room with us, who can give us feedback to guide the story to make sure that we tell it right, is incredibly important. And then also ethically, I think it's important to have a diverse set of voices amongst our team. And Daniel was a huge person to be a part of our diverse team. But it wasn't only just Daniel. We also had Michelle Lanier, who's our executive producer, who's been a guiding light for us throughout the entire process. Katie Matthews and Catherine Ryerson, our two producers, have also been incredible assets and members of our team. And I think that's what makes our team so great, is that we have all these different diverse voices who can represent different perspectives. And ultimately, I think that's what makes a good team, and that's what made this a good film.
Monique, Daniel, anything you'd like to add?
Well, I thought it was just really important. There's even in the vocabulary, the lexicon of films, where you call people in the documentary subjects, right? That it kind of lends itself to kind of an exploitive kind of relationship between the viewer, the audience member, and the people that are being shown and speaking to you from the other side of the screen. And one of the things that was just extremely important to me is that the film help people make connection is extremely important. And so I really love that, Daniel and so many other people, part of the Mossville project team, have really taken a concerted effort around how they hold and organize the screenings to have full and rich audience discussion with people who are part of the filmmaking, people who were in the film across the country. Of course, that's cut back with COVID and doing things. This our first virtual kind of discussion like this over video conference, but still maintaining that is, I think, with this new technology is extremely important going forward. But the main thing is that it's not something that people kind of observe as though it's in a petri dish and examine, but that they really make connection with how we all live, right? And I think when you were saying, as a blooming teenager going to DC and learning and talking to other folks and realizing that no one understood what you meant when you said shelter in place, right? And because no one was living that reality. Well, that's all changing now with the COVID-19. We call it stay-at-home orders, but that first language they were using that they had to fall back on was the language from industrialized communities, shelter in place. And they've, sanitized the language a little bit, but it's pretty much the same kind of thing where you shut yourself in a home as a way to protect yourself from what's happening outdoors. In this case, and the transmission of the disease. But for Mossville and so many other communities, it's this facility accident that releases something toxic or flammable that can hurt you. But people being able to make those connections, in some ways, it's kind of happening organically with this pandemic. But I think the way in which Alex and Daniel and their colleagues have worked is to bring through conversation and dialogue ways in which people can see themselves and understand what's happening, but also see how it's playing out in their cities and in their communities as well.
Yeah, I think that's a great
Organizing
point.
requires that. Organizing for change requires that people make relationship and be in connection.
For sure. And that's been something that's been really important to our team, is that it doesn't just end once the film is finished. You know, we've embarked on this impact strategy where the film can be used as a tool for other environmental justice organizations to raise money and to make change. And it's more than just the production of the film and the post-production. It's also the distribution of the film that's really important to keep those values front and center for us.
Yeah, I think the onboarding of Lentoria Newton, and I think that's one of the biggest strengths of this team are the people that's a part of the team. I don't think that you could ask for better people. I mean, just some of the conference calls that we had, I wish that people could almost be, you know, just a wiretap for a moment, just to hear some of the conference calls. I feel like we covered every detail that we could. One of the things that stood out most to me was the scene where Stacy's being prohibited from leaving his property. We had a discussion about whether or not we should show the gentleman's face who stopped him from leaving his property. You know, it was a pretty lengthy discussion because we thought some of us thought it would be impactful to show this guy. You know, we were almost comfortable demonizing this guy because he was keeping Stacy from leaving his property rightfully. You know, but then we had to step back, you know, because some of the people of the team were like, well, this guy's just doing his job, you know, and he's just trying to feed his family just like the next man. You know, I feel like we had conversations about so many different intricate parts of, you know, not just the environmental aspect, but ethics in general.
Yes. I'm glad that you
That made this film really, really powerful and relatable to a lot of people.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm happy that you brought that up because, you know, as a documentary film crew, you're always thinking about what's the most ethical choice. You think about, you know, what it is that's going to propel the story, that's really going to illustrate, you know, the person that you're interviewing, the community that you're capturing. You know, sometimes there's some emotional moments that you want to capture just to really drive home what they are going through. You come across some tense situations that you have on camera, but, you know, at the same time, you have to think about, you know, is this, you know, just because it drives the story, is it, you know, still the right approach to, you know, convey this, to, you know, communicate what it is as it relates to the topic at hand. So I'm glad that you brought that up. So at the center of the story, we mentioned Stacey Ryan a few times, and then also the Jackson family, the couple that we see, you know, having to make that hard decision of moving out of their house and, you know, going to, you know, look for a new house. How did you come to meet them as well as the other people that you interviewed throughout the film?
Well, as I said, waiting for me when I first arrived in Mossville was some members of Mossville Environmental Action Now. And I sat with them that evening and talked for a while. And the next day, they began taking me around the town. At the time, I didn't really imagine making a feature-length documentary. I just finished one. And so at first, I thought that maybe I would just make a short piece that could be of use to Mossville Environmental Action Now. And then one of the Mossville residents named Ronald Carrier, I spent the morning interviewing him, and he was like, I want to take you over to this other part of Mossville and introduce you to a man named Stacey Ryan. He's living out there by himself. At this point, they had begun clearing the land, but there hadn't really been serious construction. And so he drove me out there. And when I pulled up to Stacey Ryan's property, I really had no idea who was going to walk out of this little trailer. It was kind of already somewhat of a wasteland. And, you know, out walked Stacey Ryan. And I just had no idea that he would be such a charismatic and intelligent, resourceful, vulnerable, honest person, which is, you know, all the things that make for great characters in a film. And as soon as I met Stacey and I got to know him, I realized that he was really an incredibly impactful person. And that he would make a great character in a film. And the other thing is that Stacey really wanted me to be there. He really wanted me to be there filming with him. And I think as documentary filmmakers, there's always a little bit of a dance of how much are you encouraging your characters to be a part of it? How much do they really want to? And something that really drew me in about Stacey is that he really wanted me to be there. He spent the whole weekend filming with me, and then he asked me to come back the next weekend and the next weekend. And it was really important to him to have his story told. And I think the type of activism that he exhibits was also very fascinating and interesting. In the same way that Mossville was created as a form of resistance, just by existing. It's the same way that Stacey's activism, that's how his activism looks, is his resistance is just existing in that space and refusing to leave. And I thought that was incredibly compelling. The reason that we chose the Fishers as the supporting characters is it's 3 generations of women, Miss Dorothy, Miss Erica, and Destiny, who are core members of Mossville Environmental Action now. And so they represent the more typical type of activism that we see often with protests and actions that were taking place. And we decided they would be a great kind of supporting cast for Stacey to explain what traditional activism looks like, and also explain the history of the town to really set up Stacey's story.
Thanks. And in terms of Sasso, at what point did you determine that you needed to include them in the story and informing people of, who they are? And what inspired the decision to draw a direct parallel between the Mossville residents living near that petrochemical plant and the people in the Zambella township near Secunda and Sasselberg?
Well, that was Monique in one of our early conversations. She said, to really tell this story right, you have to go to South Africa. And she was absolutely right. I think it's such a perfect example of the global scale of environmental racism and the way that these fossil fuel energy companies operate all around the world. We wanted Sasol to participate in the film. We wanted them to do an interview with us, although they refused to go on camera. But they did constantly harass us throughout our time in Mossville. We had this kind of little dance that we would do with Sasol security guards, where we would be filming on the side of the road, filming one of the petrochemical plants, and one of the Sasol security guards would approach us and tell us that you can't film. Fortunately, we had great legal advice from Monique, who affirmed to us that as long as you are on a public road, you're allowed to film whatever you want. And so the Sasol, we'd tell that to the security guards very politely, and they would say, okay, well, I want you to wait here until the sheriffs come. And we also knew from Monique that we didn't actually have to wait there because they're not police officers, so they couldn't detain us. And so we would thank them for asking us to stay, but we declined their offer and we would leave. And then a slow paced chase would ensue around Mossville, where they would just follow us around the town until the sheriffs caught up to us. And then the sheriffs would pull us over, and then we would sit on the curb for about an hour usually while the sheriffs questioned us and ran our license plates. And ultimately they knew that we weren't doing anything illegal, so they couldn't stop us from being there, and they couldn't arrest us. What they did do was the FBI got a call that we were being suspicious near potential terrorist targets. And so a couple FBI agents paid me a visit in New Orleans and interrogated me there, but also ruled out that I wasn't obviously a terrorist, and so they let me go. And so that was basically Sasol's contribution to the film, or participation in the film, was that constant harassment.
Thanks.
And I just think that Sasol kind of delivered the kill shot. I think that's worth saying. I mean, the refineries have been around for a long time, but Sasol was the refinery who came and kind of killed what was left of Mossville. And so the correlation is because Sasol is a South African refinery. And so I think one of the big things for me is when we did go to South Africa, that correlation was uncanny. If I had closed my eyes and ignored the accent, the verbiage and the conversations that were being had in the town halls, and I don't know that it was a town hall, but in the halls of South Africa were practically identical to the conversations that were being had in Mossville. So I think that's noteworthy.
So just change the accents, huh?
Yeah, just change the accents.
Goodness, goodness.
I
The
think it
plants look
also-
exactly the same. Sorry, go ahead, Minnie.
No, I was just going to say that I think it really presents that this is a human rights issue. This is a global human rights issue, that companies like Sasol and other polluting corporations can only thrive in places where oppression is accepted. And so, and you see that, right? So not only did Mossville folks historically and to present day never have a real democratic freedom to have a say over what happens in their community, right? From the very beginning of the community, which was never incorporated, so it didn't have its own political governance. So all the decisions were made at the broader parish, state, federal levels about what happens to Mossville. The residents didn't have the right to vote for much of the history of Mossville. And just to make a film and speak through that way, use film as an expression, there's further suppression and oppression and intimidation. And the same thing happens, of course, we all know the history of South Africa and the way in which the Sasol company extended the life of racial apartheid for that nation and very oppressive, brutal conditions, violence for the people who live there, indigenous Africans who live there. In the years prior to this film, Mossville Environmental Action Now members had the opportunity to go to South Africa and meet with some of the folks in the townships near the Sasol facilities. One of them, Daniel's father, your dad, went and saw the conditions there, where he described folks walking in ground level clouds of smoke from the refinery. I've had the opportunity to go to South Africa 3 times now, and on my first visit, it was really jarring to see African children play in a playground next to a chemical facility and know that it looked just the same as African American children in Louisiana in a playground in front of a Shell oil chemical facility in Norco, Louisiana. The difference is, for me as a lawyer, was that we've had 30 years of the Clean Air Act at the time that I was seeing this. And so what is it about our laws that can have the same effect as a country that had no national environmental legislation? And so it really drew me to look closer at how it really falls and breaks down. And people outside of communities like Mossville believe that there's some level of protection, there's some law out there that protects them when there isn't. And so, you know, one of the hopes I have for this film and the work that Alex and Daniel and their colleagues have done is building a demand for a change, that people should have a legal right to a safe place to live. Bottom line, it should be healthy for them to live in their own neighborhoods. And in Mossville, it never was healthy once those industrial facilities were permitted by our government in violation of basic human rights to operate in Mossville. And as Daniel said, that it just got to the point where that, you know, that last straw, right, that breaks the camel's back, 14 facilities, that 15th facility delivered a real demise to the community that was just barely hanging on with the 14 facilities that were polluting the heck out of the millions and millions of pounds of toxic chemicals on an annual basis, all allowed under our US system of environmental laws. That's got to change.
Thank you. A couple questions before I check to see if any of our audience is watching, if they have any questions. So, has anyone from Sasol or the former Jindal administration seen this film? And if so, what's been their responses?
So we haven't had a response or any outreach from Sasol or the Jindal administration. I know that some journalists who interviewed us and have written reviews on the film have gotten comment from Sasol, who have said that they are aware of the film, and they kind of give the typical talking points and by touting the amount of jobs that the facility will have, and they often hold up a couple residents who they claim are happy with their buyout offers to make themselves look good, but that's about the extent of it.
Mm-hmm. And I believe I read that article in preparation for this conversation where Sasol had been cited as saying that, they're aware that the film has been made, and they mentioned those very talking points that you just noted. And Daniel, Monique, did you want to add anything to that?
In terms of a company
I
like
think it's,
Sassel or Jindal being held accountable through the film?
Just in terms of if you've heard any responses.
I have not.
Okay.
No.
I haven't either, but I do think it's noteworthy to say that the refineries have always used like a divide and conquer tactic. They get prominent community members and they use them as pawns towards, the division of the community. Because with them leading the idea that a buyout is good, even though it's typically not fair at all, that's how they go about it.
Thanks. And then the last question I have before I turn to the audience questions, since this film has been on the festival circuit, you shared some of the responses already, particularly when you premiered it in the area neighboring Mossville. Have you noticed any grassroots activist efforts or even any legal action that's taken place since you began showing the film on the festival circuit?
So we've had oh, go ahead, Monique.
Well, I was just going to say that I haven't gone to all of the film circuits, but the few that I have where there were people with concerns about environmental issues in their home towns and communities, it really awakened them around what they could do about it and thinking about solutions, right, that have been there to whether it's, the quality of their tap water coming out of their faucets or air pollution in their area and what it's doing to health. So it's I think made people more confident and more drawn into doing something about it and rolling up their sleeves, which is really great. So I think I've seen it help support people organizing around solutions for their communities. It's great.
That's excellent to hear. And we actually have a couple questions from the audience. First question, how has your experiences in filming and creating the Mossville documentary changed you as an individual and as an activist? And what recommendations would you give to other communities that are struggling?
I'll take the first part, and then maybe I'll let Monique take the second part. For me, it's been an incredibly impactful experience. As Daniel said so eloquently, going to see the operations in South Africa was very impactful for me. Seeing the plants that look exactly like the plants that we're so used to seeing in Louisiana, even the same exact smells. It really made me have a greater understanding of the way that these multinational oil and gas operations operate. And it made me have a stronger understanding of the way that race plays a role in the extraction of resources and land from non-white communities. This is something that is a part of capitalism, and it was ever since slavery and colonialism, we've seen this extraction from non-white communities, and the oil and gas industry is just that continuation of that. And so I think I have a much stronger understanding of what environmental racism means and how it affects so many people.
Thank you. Did either of you want to add anything? Or did you have any of your own responses to the question?
Well, I would just say that part of the psychological impact of living in a community like Mossville is that you are made to feel as though you don't count and you don't matter and your voice doesn't count and it doesn't matter, that the companies have all of the power. And if you line up all of the companies that are doing this damage to our communities and our planet, they're outweighed by all the people who are harmed by it. And so I just would encourage people to not lose sight of valuing their voice and speaking out and linking arms and organizing and being accountable to communities around how to develop strategies around solutions. And for people who may not be living in a polluted community, this is an opportunity for solidarity, because we're all in one way or another have there's a spillover effect, right? So Millions of pounds of the pollution comes out of Mossville that has a toxic effect on residents. Also includes a tremendous amount of greenhouse gas emissions that contributes to climate change. And so it's in everybody's best interest, every human being's best interest, that we get a lock on what these industries are doing to our communities and to our planet, and fix the laws that allow this to happen. And we can't continue to talk about climate change and say nothing about how the Clean Air Act allows this pollution to go forward. We can't talk about how sad we are for a child suffering from a nosebleed or asthma, or increased hospitalizations and deaths from COVID-19 because of polluted communities, and say nothing about the way in which that pollution is legal and that under our US system of government. It just really, it's where the fight has got to be, is in changing the laws. We've got to have a legal right to safe, healthy neighborhoods, and we don't have that right now.
Thank you. And another question I have is, the film illuminates the impact of so many issues, from environmental contamination and civil rights disparities to cultural legacy and economic security. Yet it's told very subtly and beautifully through the lens of human experiences. Was that a specific intention in the filmmaking, or the result of the experience with the residents in Mossville?
Great question.
Yeah, absolutely. That was intentional. As Daniel said earlier, we realized early on that we couldn't tell the definitive story of all of Mossville. And we didn't want to have a talking head piece where this person says something and then the counter narrative is said. We really wanted to take people into our characters' experiences. We wanted to bring you into Stacey Ryan's space. We wanted to bring you into his perspective. And we wanted to be a character-driven story. We wanted there to be nuance. We wanted you to follow him through his day-to-day. We didn't want him to explain everything to you. We wanted you to see it. Tim Watson, one of our advising editors and one of my mentors, always uses the phrase "show, don't tell." And that was what we really tried to do in this film. So I'm glad to hear that you picked up on that.
So those are the questions I have from the audience. And just wanted to know if you have any concluding remarks with our conversation with regards to this particular project, what your hopes are, and if you want to make a direct tie to what we're experiencing right now with COVID-19, especially just hearing what's been happening in Louisiana and New Orleans in particular. I think this would be an opportune time to address that if you want.
Yeah, since I actually have to leave, I'll go ahead and go first if you don't mind. I just want to again say thank you. Thanks to everybody that watched, because yes, this is my community, but again, like we've said several times, we're interconnected. I think the pandemic that we're facing now actually shows us more than anything ever just how connected we are. Something that happened, wherever it started, it is, here, and we're all facing it. And I think the same goes for what's happening with these refineries. It's just a matter of time before it's knocking at your front door. So I think we should keep that in mind. A couple of the things that I always point out that we can do. One person can make a difference. Never think that your small action is not significant enough to, make a change. So by all means, start whatever that small action is. I always try to avoid saying, hey, do exactly this. I learned from Miss Monique, because I always learn from Miss Monique. I learned that, it's because it's so macro, we can't focus just on our individual problems in our individual communities. It needs to be something, more aggressive for the entire, we need clean air and clean water legislation towards that, so that's a really big thing. Of course, follow us on Facebook, Instagram. The more people that hear about it, the more people you tell about it, the more word we can get out there. And if it just hits that one person who has some authority to make a difference, it's gonna really do what it's supposed to do. Again, I'm gonna reiterate what Stacey told me. People are dying, people have died, people are continuing to die. He's got a stack of obituaries. It is important that we recognize that while we saw it as a film, this was someone's life that we witnessed. This is still someone's life. There are still people in Mossville who are fighting a cause, we really need to take it upon ourselves to make a difference. But thank you all for having me, okay?
Thank you very much. And the social media handle is Mossville Film, correct?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, okay.
If Mossville Film, Mossville When Great Trees Fall on Facebook, you'll find us. We're out there. I feel guilty.
Yeah, I understand. I understand you have to go. Thank you so much for joining us. And best wishes, to all the people in the surrounding areas of Mossville, and continuing the fight and receiving the justice that they deserve.
Thank y'all. Have a good night.
Take care, Daniel.
Bye-bye.
There's actually another question. Either you can go ahead and make your remarks, and then I could pose the question, or I could pose the question now.
It's up to you, Dante. It's your show.
Okay.
I guess I can go ahead and say that the way that it relates to what's happening right now, I think that everybody is having a little bit of an insight of what it's like to live with an invisible killer. I think that's something that's very familiar to people who live next to these refineries and industrial facilities, is to have this, there's a certain psychological terror of knowing that there could be something all around you that can hurt you, that can kill you, that can hurt your loved ones. The difference is that if you stay in your house, you can avoid this virus, but if you live next to one of these chemical plants, it comes through your water, it comes through the air that comes through your window at night. And I hope that we can all have a little bit more empathy for what it's like for folks who live next to these industrial facilities. And then obviously we're seeing these same systemic inequities that are causing communities of color to experience high mortality rates. Those are the same structural racist elements at play that make it so that non-white communities all over the world are denied access to clean air and clean water at a higher rate. And then I also want to say that, I'm sure some people may already know this, but there's been a huge lax in regulation on these industrial facilities during this time. The EPA has stopped regulating them, and that is criminal. I think that for me, having seen what these plants do when they are abiding by EPA regulations is horrifying and deadly. And to imagine that they are operating without any sort of regulation, and there are people who are sheltering in place right next to them who aren't supposed to leave their homes right next to these facilities while they are going full steam. It's horrifying and it's unforgivable.
Mm-hmm. Well said.
I would just say that we're seeing in real time, tragically, with the over 50,000 people dead, and and still no clarity in terms of how far the infection has spread, that how low priority health has in our policies. And Mossville, I think, is an extreme result of that, right? In terms of an entire community where people lived, where they raised their families for generations, where the land gave them everything in terms of fertile soil and waterways where they could fish from, and healthy air, was just taken away from them because health was never part of any policy around environmental concerns or industrial development or manufacturing or refining, let alone the health of Black African Americans in this country. And so those two things are right now before us as a nation, global member of the planet, where we're seeing the same kind of decisions that led to and resulted in Mossville turning from a place that was a safe haven where families came to live in droves after the Civil War, is now turned into something that has been too toxic, too dangerous to live in because of governmental approval and authorizations of toxic industrial developments. We're all in some ways seeing through this COVID-19 pandemic, seeing that same kind of scenario play out, but on a more national level where health is insignificant. Protecting health is insignificant. Right now, we have states thinking about reopening places without a real concern of, will health be protected? Huh? What are you talking about? This is, I mean, Milwaukee, the situation that for people to speak out and be a part of the democratic process, you put your health and your life at risk, right? So I think the timing of this is one where we can't ignore that that Mossville is not in a separate and apart from what happens in the rest of this country. It's like Mossville could only happen in a country that would do this in a time of a pandemic.
Well said. And the last question I do have says, thank you for this film. How long has the community been under assault by these petrochemical plants? Also, is the comment, it's appalling that what was depicted in this film is legal. And it's not just depicted in the film, it's still legal.
That's right. It's legal. All of those facilities, all of that pollution, the Sasol company, what it was doing to the community and Stacey Ryan, all of that was done after environmental permits under the Clean Air Act was issued. And that should give you the sense that, well, maybe these permits aren't what we need, and maybe this law doesn't do what it needs to do. But Mossville was founded just before the Civil War and grew after. The facilities began making their way in the late 1940s, and were small, little factories farther away from the community, but continue to grow and enlarge and get bigger and more toxic and more polluting over time, to the point where this one small community has 15 major toxic industrial facilities, Phillips 66 oil refinery being one of them in this community.
Well, first, I just want to say that, and I wish I would have said this to Daniel while he was still with us. I'm happy to see that you all are safe and healthy where you are in this time. Secondly, thank you for making this film a reality. Thank you for magnifying what's happening in Mossville and encouraging us to magnify what's happening in our own communities in regards to environmental justice and environmental racism. And I hope once we're out of this situation, whether it's later this year or even next year, there will be a time where, this can be screened in Milwaukee outside of our laptops. And, we hope to have you in person and be part of this conversation. And the people who've seen this film can directly thank you for phenomenal work that you've done. Thank you for showing, how activism can be done effectively and efficiently through film.
Thank you, Dante.
Thank you.
Appreciate that very much. And thank you to Alex Klustrom. Thank you to Monique Harden. Thank you to Daniel Bennett. And thank you all for tuning in to this conversation about Mossville, When Great Trees Fall. Special thanks to Milwaukee Film and Frederick Medical College of Wisconsin for sponsoring the Minority Health Film Series. Take care, stay safe, and stay healthy.